Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent,
And I'm Chris Holliday.
and this is an episode of firsts for quite a few reasons.
Yes.
Chris, it's the first time we're talking about a Laurel and Hardy movie.
Yeah.
I suspect it's the first time you've seen this movie.
Not only is it the first time I've seen it, I think this is maybe the first time I've seen a Laurel and Hardy film. So do with that what you will.
We will. And this is the first time that, oddly, I'm sitting in the room with our special guest I'll introduce in just a second, and you, Chris, are on the other line with us because I happen to be in New York at the moment, which means I'm had the pleasure of being here in person. So, listeners, if this sounds a bit different to normal, that's what's happening, but we'll make it work. Today we're talking about Babes in Toyland. Produced, perhaps most significantly, by Hal Roach, starring Laurel and Hardy, and nominally a kind of adaptation of an operetta by Victor Herbert, loosely based on kind of the Mother Goose fairy tales, whatever that means. There are fiddling cats, there are toy makers, there are people who lives in shoes, there's three little pigs. I am in my fantasy element. Chris, is there anything to talk about in terms of animation this week?
Yes, so I think there are two very short bits and then one that's maybe a broader thing, which is, yes, there is Mickey Mouse playing some sort of performing monkey type role. Yes, there is a sequence of stop motion animation at the end. And then thirdly, it kind of got me thinking, I guess, about some of the stuff, because, I don't often think about the stuff that you've published, Alex, but this is one of those instances where, in fact, I was thinking about your work on The Dark Crystal and sort of Jim Henson and sort of thinking about adjacent animation, things that aren't frame by frame, aren't animation in the purest sense, but maybe we're in the world of sort of people in costumes, puppetry. This is looking forward to animatronics, animation as a quality in live action. So I've got some thoughts going around my head. But yeah, really excited to talk about it. As I said, my first and only Laurel and Hardy film. So let's do it.
Okay, on that bombshell, let's introduce our very special guest. So I'm sitting in the room here with Rob King, professor at Columbia University. Rob is a film historian with interests in American genre cinema, popular culture, and social history. His work to date has largely been on comedy, although we're going to talk about a new book of his later that, if it's comedic in a different way. I'll put it that way. He's perhaps best known for his two works, The Fun Factory, the Keystone Film Company, and the Emergence of Mass Culture, and the follow-up, Hokum, the early sound slapstick short and Depression era mass culture, both published by the University of California Press. And in those books, particularly the latter, he challenges the received wisdom that sound destroyed the slapstick tradition, tracing instead the kind of continuation of slapstick traditions in the early sound comedies, of which this is one. Rob, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me.
And thanks for recommending Babes in Toyland. This is one of these movies that I saw when I was in the early kind of years of my PhD, and I thought, that was odd. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to write about that ever or use it in any way, shape, or form. So I'm delighted you've brought it back into my life. Babes in Toyland, obviously listeners might be able to piece together why it fits with some of your research portfolio, but perhaps you can tell us what the film means to you.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I ended up writing about the film was it's in the book Hokum, where I'm talking about how slapstick kind of weathered the transition from the silent era to the early sound era. When Laurel and Hardy were like arguably the team that weathered that transition most successfully without seeming to really break their stride at all. So Laurel and Hardy became important for the study. But then if you're talking about Laurel and Hardy and the transition to sound, you have to talk about their features. One of the things that is really a hallmark of the Hal Roach Studios in their early sound work was the way in which music was used. Was kind of orchestral accompaniment, courtesy of composers like Leroy Shield and Marvin Hatley. But also in terms of music, then we need to think about operettas as the vehicles, the kind of framework that Roach used most commonly for Laurel and Hardy's features as they transitioned into features. So that's how I ended up writing about Babes in Toyland.
It's interesting, and you talk quite a lot about. I was rereading some of the chapters from your book last night and this morning, and you talk quite a lot about fantasy and kind of the fairy tale register in this movie.
Yeah.
It made me think about some ideas I've sort of gestated with, but never really kind of articulated, which is that one would think perhaps if one was trying to map this period quite, I don't know, generalistically or lazily, that you might
Right.
think fantasy would have a problem when sound arrives, right? Because the conventional wisdoms of sound is that it's kind of more realistic, or it brings a
Right,
more
right,
realist
right, right.
sense of the world.
Well,
Things get less theatrical, things get less expressive. There's less attention on the visual, there's more attention on the kind of dialogue. We go back to kind of quotes canned theatre for a bit, unquotes, because
yeah.
we're going to problematize that. But actually, from my research, and it sounds like from yours, there's almost a resurgence of interest in kind of fantasy in the early 30s, and this is a really good example of it. But there are others. There's the Alice in Wonderland adaptation from 1933. You talk a little bit about the Wizard of Oz. That's obviously to come a few years down the line. So, what do you think it is about with this film? Why they've turned to this kind of register to try and address some of the kind of issues of early sound comedies, or the potentials of early sound comedies?
Well, I wonder whether they moved to that register because of early sound comedy, or whether it might be framed better as early sound feature length comedy.
Okay.
One of the things that's happening at Roach and at Laurel and Hardy, like at this in the 30s, is that Roach is far-sighted enough to realize that the short subject market is not long for this world, or at least not in terms of slapstick. This is the era of double bills and so on and so forth. So Roach is transitioning to features over the course of the 1930s, and Laurel and Hardy are the key team through which he's making that transition. Uh, Now, so much so that the by the time Babes in Toyland comes out, Laurel and Hardy only do like a handful of shorts after this, like maybe
Mm.
four, I think. Otherwise, they're making two features a week, and I think operetta became a format that resolved what had always been a problem for slapstick, which is how do you get it to be feature length? Right, like how do we kind of elaborate this so that a commodity, the slapstick film that was primarily one or maybe two reels in the teens, this had become increasingly out of step with trends within the industry towards the multi-reel feature, by the end of the teens and into the 1920s. So how do we adapt slapstick to feature length? Right. And you could look at like the comedians, Chaplin, Keaton, etc., and look at the different strategies that they employ to that end. And I think Roach's strategy was very idiosyncratic. It was also the only strategy that depended on the fact of sound, and that strategy was the operetta, in which Laurel and Hardy would appear as as kind of like subsidiary
Yeah.
hench person sort of roles. Like that's what you see in The Devil's Brother, which was the first operetta film that came out of the Roach Studios, and it's what then gets developed in Babes in Toyland, which was their second.
Mm. I had a kind of question, I suppose, dovetailing with that, which was I'm not familiar with Laurel and Hardy. My knowledge of sort of silent cinema is terrible. But my two questions were sort of, I was wondering where this came within their sort of career. That was my first question, which you've sort of kind of gestured to. But also, I was struck by the idea of them being figures that could be themed to fantasy. And I'm just trying to think of a modern day. I was trying to think of an equivalent, and the only the only thing I could think of was this is going to sound dreadful, but the Minions. The way in which the
Yeah, I
Minions
think that's
are
that's
these
fair.
kind of these, and Ewan Kirkland talks about this, the sort of the themability of certain animated characters to the Halloween, to the Christmas, but then also these kind of blank figures that you can theme in particular ways. So I was trying to think of whether that was fair, and is that a common tactic where you have figures again, my knowledge is very sketchy, but sort of figures like Laurel and Hardy, where they are moving across these different genres, but they're also in this case being themed to the conventions of fantasy, and presumably that was quite a common thing for them, or is that not the case? You have about the henchman style thing made me think of it.
Yeah, I think that I think you're right that there is a kind of overlap between the conventions of slapstick clowning and pantomime, and by which I mean pantomime like dumb show kind of thing, and the conventions of pantomime in the other sense, like Christmas pantomime, that sort of thing, uh, and um, and that's kind of that is you can see evidence of that in the way in which a number of slapstick clowns ended up appearing in these kind of movies. Like you could refer to the first film adaptation of The Wizard of Oz from 1925, which has Larry Seaman, like the comedian, in a in a key role.
And an early role for I forget which one's Laurel and which one's Hardy.
Hardy,
A really early role for Hardy, right?
Yeah, absolutely right. Then you have things like Abbott and Costello in Jack and the Beanstalk, Jerry
Right.
Lewis in Cinderfella, Three Stooges and Snow White. So there is this kind of connection that can be drawn. It's not the most fertile connection. It's not like there are a huge number of movies, but there are enough to suggest that that slapstick clowning did find a home in fantasy movies. Uh, although I'm not sure how we really want to define fantasy movies, but I guess that's
We're 160 or so podcasts in, and we haven't quite done it yet, Rob. So you can give it your best shot if you like. But yes, no. Well, I was going to, and also actually, it goes beyond that. It's not just this era specific in terms of the comedian match, right? There's lots of examples of comedians right up until the present day where their star image is somehow contained or wrestled with or mediated through the introduction of fantasy, whether it's someone like Jim Carrey, who often does like The Mask, even things like Liar Liar, which is not a kind of might not people think of as a fantasy
but the
thing.
Dr. Seuss,
the Dr. Seuss stuff,
right?
yeah, absolutely.
Mike Myers as the Cat in the Hat. It's the same. It's the same thing, really.
Yeah. I mean, even what's like, I can't believe I've forgotten his name because he's like the richest person in the world and does all those Netflix movies. Adam Sandler. Like Adam Sandler eventually has to do like these kind of time travel movies, or that one where he puts on magic shoes. Like, there's something odd about the kind of. Maybe it's I don't know, to be kind of, let's throw some ideas out there. Something about exaggeration or artifice or kind of, the excesses of performance that both comedy and fantasy lean into. And then in this era, back to the 1930s, we've got there's like there's the Topper franchise, which is kind of like these ghost comedies. They're not necessarily using comedians.
Also Roach films.
And also Roach films. Yeah, I hadn't made that connection. Yeah, okay. So there's something there, isn't there?
With special effects as well. Again, like Babes in Toyland. So yeah, there's you're absolutely right. I mean, it is I think the relation or the question of where Babes in Toyland fits into the emergence of fantasy as a genre is an interesting one. You mentioned Alice in Wonderland, the Paramount 1933 film. And you also mentioned, of course, The Wizard of Oz, the 1939 film, and I think Babes in Toyland exists in a kind of relation to both of those movies. Alice in Wonderland. The actor who plays Alice, Charlotte Henry, she's little Bo Peep in Babes in Toyland. Alice in Wonderland was famously a bomb. And just for being a kind of weird movie, right? Where you have like all of these famous Paramount stars, unrecognizable, because they're wearing giant rubber masks. So yes, that really is Cary Grant as the Mock Turtle, but you don't see Cary Grant; you just hear his voice. And I think the film is a kind of oddball failure in that respect. I think that tendency towards the kind of the rubber mask pantomime aspect of Alice in Wonderland carries over into Babes in Toyland as well. The connection though with Wizard of Oz is much more multi-layered, much deeper, and we can get into that. I mean, it's a connection in terms of the source. Babes in Toyland, the operetta was something that came out. I think it was 1903. That was trying to capitalize on the success of the Wizard of Oz operetta. That was an adaptation of L. Frank Baum's novel, of course. And so they kind of follow similar pathways as with kind of these operetta or musical comedy versions that then get adapted into film. Those films in turn become kind of seasonal classics, on in the UK, like I don't know whether like Wizard of Oz was still like the kind of that thing that was always on, but Babes in Toyland has a role similar to that in the US also, where it was and still is a regular screening between Thanksgiving and Christmas on a local New York station, WPIX. So yeah.
Oh wow, okay,
Still to this day. Yep.
That's okay. I don't know where to go with that. Let's just back up a second, I think, because this is probably one of these episodes where some listeners probably aren't familiar with the movie, even though they're interested in everything we're talking about. So could we, I mean, I'll give it a go, but Rob, you might be better at it because you've probably seen it more times than I have. Do you want to do a quick synopsis of this movie and its kind of glorious pantomime-esque frivolity?
Yeah. Okay. So, what is this film about? It's kind of difficult to
We've got
say.
about another 45 minutes to work that out.
So it's set in Toyland. Laurel and Hardy have roles as the toy makers' assistants. And early on, they've been putting in an order for Santa Claus, but they got it wrong. He asked for Santa, that is, asked for 600. Well, since this is the UK, I get to say Father Christmas.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
I never get to do that. My children always tease me when I say Father Christmas instead of Santa Claus. Anyway, so Father Christmas, like they're filling an order for Father Christmas, and instead of creating 600 1-foot tall wooden soldiers, they make 100 6-foot tall wooden soldiers. Anyway, leave that to one side.
Yeah.
In the meantime, within the
Because
world,
the film does.
within the world of Toyland, all sorts of shenanigans are happening, mainly concerning the romance between Little Bo Peep and Tom Tom the Piper's son, and the evil machinations of Silas Barnaby, who wants to get the mortgage from the little old woman who lives in the shoe.
That's right.
So he wants her shoe mortgage. And
Yeah.
anyway, for some reason, in order to accomplish this, he has to break up. He ends up kidnapping Little Bo Peep and no. Anyway.
Yeah, he tries to get little Bo Peep to marry him. She won't.
Yeah.
He tries all these machinations with the mortgage.
Right.
That doesn't work because
Then
Laurel and
he
Hardy get
accuses
involved.
them of pig napping.
That's right.
Right.
3 little pigs.
Yeah, for which Little Bo Peep and Tom Tom get sent to Bogeyland.
Yep.
This then results in a all-out war in which the denizens of Bogeyland, led by Silas Barnaby, try to take over Toyland. Okay, and this is where the loose end from earlier kicks in. Cue the 100 6-foot tall wooden soldiers like battling against the bogeyman, and ultimately all is victorious, and the romance is preserved.
And
Yeah.
there are versions of this that's called March of the Wooden Soldiers, I believe.
Yeah.
For exactly that reason, that there's this standout sequence at the end, which hopefully we'll come to in a bit because it's where we really get animation-y.
Yeah.
So yeah, British listeners will probably recognise the pantomime quality in all of that. There's a kind of glorious looseness and wackiness to the kind of plotting that that I think it would be a disservice to the film to say they're not trying to make a virtue of, to some degree, right? The fact that, I mean, just as kind of a tangent, because I'm in New York right now, I obviously am taking a couple of Broadway shows, and I just happened to watch a new adaptation of the Pirates of Penzance, and I'd forgotten how cronky that operetta plot is. It's all about like this guy who can't leave the pirates until he's 21, but he's born on the 29th of February, so technically that's not it's this really cronky narrative.
500 years.
So like there is and the British pantomime is very much based on this. There is this kind of structure that the plotting does its best to kind of break almost. And Laurel and Hardy serve as kind of foils, but also, well, that's I guess the next question is, how much are they foils to the plot and how much are they kind of advancing the plot? And that's an interesting thing perhaps to talk about, because I expect that's part of the tensions of this kind of
I mean, I think that is an interesting question. But yeah, I mean, the pantomime element is clearly there, and I think it's there also in Alice in Wonderland and The Wizard of Oz. But I think especially Alice in Wonderland and Babes in Toyland, that they have. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. They have that kind of shambolic quality of a stage pantomime. And actually, I was thinking that in certain respects, I don't know, the Paramount version of Alice in Wonderland feels to me like a school pantomime where the teachers get to be in the, where you get to see the teachers be the lead roles here, where you get to see, again, W.C. Fields is Humpty Dumpty, so on and so forth. So there is this kind of charmingly shambolic quality to both of those films that I think has a relation to pantomime. Now, as to Laurel and Hardy's role within all of this, that's an interesting one. I mean, I think that this question of how do you sustain a slapstick feature, is relevant here. Like, do we try and have like our clowns carry the burden of the plot all the way through? That's what the first Laurel and Hardy features had attempted with Pardon Us and Pack Up Your Troubles. But by the time we get to the operetta approach with The Devil's Brother, Fra Diavolo, that's the first in 1933, and then Babes in Toyland in 34, what we have is a structure where the main plot, so to speak, is a romance plot. In relation to which Laurel and Hardy serve as kind of, they're marginal figures. They might help the young lovers come together in some respect or not. I think that that's the role they play in The Devil's Brother. It's the role that they play in Babes in Toyland. It's the role that they play in The Bohemian Girl and in many of these operettas. I do think that that with Babes in Toyland, that was the film in which Roach was able to find the formula that included Laurel and Hardy, but also allowed them to retain a certain prominence within the film's overall plotting. If you look in The Devil's Brother, at The Devil's Brother, I mean, Laurel and Hardy they are very interstitial characters. They just kind of show up in these scenes that occur kind of separate from the main plot. Whereas in Babes in Toyland, that connection is less sharply drawn. They seem more integrated with the world of Toyland as characters within that world, and I think it's because it's not an adult world. It is a world of childhood. So they fit into the world in a way that they don't fit into the world of the Bohemian Girl and things like that. Which is why I think that this is among their most successful features. Certainly of the operetta series that they made.
Well, I was thinking about the sort of fluidity of fantasy and I mean, when in another life, and it's funny you said about kind of plays at school. So I used to write children's plays and pantomimes and things, and one of the things that they always liked was this sort of mashing together of what would happen if Annie met Oliver Twist, and sort of I used to smash them all together. And there is this kind of quality of that in this film where there's just an assumption that fantasy is open and available, and it's just layering on all these different kind of fairy tale characters and figures of fantasy. And of course, it comes right back. I'd forgotten, as we were talking, but the film obviously opens with the storybook and the kind of
Yes.
I can't remember which character it is though. I can't. Is it
I
Mother
think it's
Goose?
Mother Goose.
Mother
yeah.
Goose.
It is Mother Goose. Yes, of course. Who comes up with a goose at the front? And it was I was reminded, because we've done a footnote episode before on the sort of Disney storybook opening, but I've been doing some research into sort of early lightning sketches, performance animation, and a number of films by Méliès, Gaston Vail, films that are called like The Magic Book, Artist's Dream, The Hilarious Posters, and they all begin with they begin with fantasy, but they also begin with sort of enchantment, where things get enchanted off the page. And so I was sort of that reminded. This is one of those things where I'm trying to pull a film that isn't explicitly fantasy actually into explicitly animation into a broader sort of lineage of animation's proclivity for enchantment, the narrative of the enchanted drawing that often then, as Méliès films would go on, they'd provide this sort of backdrop for these ultimate stop frame effects and this kind of reconjuring of the two-dimensional image into three dimensions. But I'd forgotten that it started with that sort of this is a book that is essentially fantasy's greatest hits. It is everything that you want, and all these things can, and the film is giving us fantasy kind of off the page, and it's doing so through this feature length or 77 minutes, let's say, but feature length where all of these fantasy elements can kind of coexist, and presumably that's part of the pleasure of the film, is that it's pulling from all these different really popular, really and then folding Laurel and Hardy into that. They are equally as they are on that register, as you said. They don't feel out of place in the film. They are part of, in the way that stars work, they are more than people. There's this sort of, they are figures of fantasy as much as Mother Goose, and there's an interesting thing that they're doing. I'm just fascinated with what the film is doing with Laurel and Hardy, because in any other film you'd be taken out of the fantasy to go, oh, but this doesn't make sense, but it seems to work that they maintain the level of fantasy, I think, rather than disrupt it.
Yeah. And actually, in like the early story drafts that Hal Roach penned for the film adaptation of Babes in Toyland, that Stan and Ollie actually play fairy tale characters. So I think Stan was cast as Simple Simon, and Ollie as the Pieman. So they actually they play one of the more defined Mother Goose type roles, or they were initially meant to play those more defined roles. It's interesting, I mean, you brought up Disney a few times there, and I would agree absolutely that this is a film that's offering a kind of compendium of childhood attractions, like drawn from Mother Goose, but also I think significantly updating that by bringing Disney in. So we do have a kind of Mickey Mouse character show up strangely. Actually, I think that Mickey Mouse character is maybe responsible for my favorite shots in the whole movie.
Yeah.
And then we have the Three Little Pigs. So it's updating the Mother Goose repertoire to include much more recent stuff.
And mapping this on, I don't know my Silly Symphonies history, Chris, but mapping this on to the Silly Symphonies, how you're talking about greatest hits. Is there any synergy between the fairy tales that are being retold through the Silly Symphonies at this point? Because I can't help notice we've got the Three Little Pigs, and there's a kind of, this is kind of, I guess, a question to both of you here, but I guess there's that, and then there's also this odd, because Hal Roach and Walt Disney were friends or co-workers. Disney gave him permission to use the kind of figure of Mickey Mouse in the film, I believe. I think at one point this film he was kind of interested in doing it as an animation, Babes in Toyland, and then it kind of got passed. I think at one point RKO were interested in the project.
Yeah, because RKO was Disney's distributor.
Yeah. So there's a kind of odds. Disney's there, but not quite there in a lot of these stuff, and the man rather than the kind of the company so much as this.
But can you imagine as well? I mean, like the fact that that we get Mickey Mouse, which is just it's a little monkey in a Mickey Mouse outfit, and the three little pigs, that we get that in this movie, and that was just Hal Roach like asking Walt Disney, and he's like, yes,
sure,
and then like we've gone through like what 50 years of copyright law being updated in order for this exact thing not to ever happen, like because of Disney. Like, we don't want Mickey Mouse to enter into the public domain. They pushed that as far as they could. Ultimately, you couldn't push it anymore, and now it's entering the public domain. But the comparison between like Walt Disney back then, go ahead, use Mickey Mouse, versus like whatever you would expect of like getting sued for like millions, if you tried to do that today, is an interesting object lesson in where we've come.
Well, and also just, imagine how easy it would be to use a Disney image in an academic publication. If it was that easy, hey, can I just use that image from that film? Just to go back to Alex's point, a quick Google search has told me that this film is 34. So we've had the year before, we've had The Pied Piper, we've also had Three Little Pigs. 1933, and then a couple of years before that, 32, we've had Babes in the Woods, which is what I want to call this film every time we mention it. But also there's a film, they've had April 1931, they've had Mother Goose Melodies, but also they've had a film in 1930 directed by Wilfred Jackson called Midnight in a Toy Shop, which is exactly what you imagine that film to be. Midnight, the toys come alive. Animation is writ large with these kinds of toys come alive narratives. So this is not entirely dislocated from the kinds of stuff that the first sort of 5 years, the first half of the Silly Symphonies, I guess, were interested in.
Actually, there's a quote. I was going through my notes on this film, and I found a quote from Time magazine from a review of Babes in Toyland that you might be interested in here, that I thought would work for the podcast. So this is the quote: "With the notable exception of Walt Disney cartoons, fantasy is not a form of entertainment in which the cinema excels." So that was from a review of Babes in Toyland.
Interesting. There are quite a few reviews like that around this era. Alice in Wonderland, it was full of, this is an example of why you can't do fantasy on the big screen. There's this whole, it's that kind of literary privilege of, on the page you get to imagine these things, but as soon as you make it visual, it's moribund and all this kind of stuff. What is also interesting is there's that famous Leo Handel Audience Research Bureau thing that comes out a bit later on in the sort of late 30s, early 40s, I believe it is, that you can still get today. And there are surveys in there asking them, audiences, their favourite types of movies. And fantasy is one of like the 10 categories they've selected. It scores really badly. It's odd that they've selected it as one of the 10 categories. I think that says something. But there's another question that talks about it kind of, do you enjoy movies with improbable happenings? And the answer's like 85% yes. So there's a certain weird thing going on where audiences like the idea of a story with elements that they don't believe in. They don't want it to be called a fantasy.
They like improbability, but only if it's real improbability.
Or one wonders whether it's coded within a comedy movie or a romantic movie, or like there's quite a lot of fantasies that aren't fantasies in this era, right? So there's something odd going on with audience tastes in this era that we should.
I think though that it does. I wonder whether it does relate to like something that you mentioned earlier about the advent of sound, like a lot of the discourse about this time about the greater realism of sounds, that sound kind of in a certain sense reinforces the indexicality of the moving image, because now you see and hear the real thing that has been recorded. And whether that kind of mitigated against the success of fantasy, like in the early sound era. I mean, I think that when you look at like Babes in Toyland and Alice in Wonderland, and we have these characters that are wearing like these big rubber masks and suits and things like that, and for us, like maybe now that this is part of their kind of cultish appeal because these films look so strange. But I wonder whether they hadn't quite yet kind of figured out or like being able to extricate themselves from a stage conception of how do we depict like these kind of characters, right? Which is why maybe Wizard of Oz is like a kind of turning point because yes, we have the characters as these fantasy as the Tin Man, and so on and so forth, but the makeup and the costuming is more it's less fragrantly artificial, I guess, than in the case with the earlier movies.
Yeah, there's that, and then also because you've triggered my Wizard of Oz obsession, so I'm going to talk about that for a second. But I think there's that, and there might also be a kind of there's a psychological causality if you go back to kind of Bordwell's language on classical Hollywood and continuity that's in the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
Because I mean, there's the obvious thing about like it being a dream, but there's just the more kind of sense of narrative momentum. There's more of a sense of Dorothy is the anchor of all of this. This is a story about Dorothy set in this magical land.
Yeah.
There's less of that in things like this and Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah, it's more like a series of scenes in which we get to see, and here are the three little pigs.
Yeah.
Let's enjoy them for a few seconds, and now we'll see these people. And
Yeah. And the Wizard of Oz carefully almost does that all of this is part of in the kind of differences in the novel. Like the Carol novel is that, isn't it? Like each chapter,
right.
Alice meets a new character. She's not really doesn't really drive the plot. She just sort of wanders around a bit. These aren't differences that are just Hollywood. These are differences in the source text. Whilst the Balm source text has these kind of every chapter a new character is introduced, but there's part of this kind of road movie or aesthetic of momentum moving through the land. They're all going somewhere. So there's some of that going on as well. I think.
It's kind of like Wizard of Oz solves the problem that Alice and Babes had kind of demonstrated. It solves it both in costuming and mise en scène and in terms of narrative. Right?
We should throw in as well, and Chris, maybe you should come in on this. Is we should also throw in Snow White in the middle of this, right? Because and Snow White's doing some of this, right? I mean, actually, every time I watch Snow White, I am amazed how episodic it actually. Because I've said this before on the podcast, but actually, the plot of Snow White, if you wrote down the plot of Snow White, about comfortably a half, maybe 2/3 of plotting happens in the opening captions and the closing captions of the movie. A lot of it is like, let's watch them wash up the room for like 10 minutes. There's lots of these kind of, I suspect, Chris, maybe you can jump in on this, but I suspect that's a lot to do with the production process where everyone's got a sequence that they have to make, so it's quite easy to kind of divide it into these kind of sequences like that. But this is like that too, right? There are these, we're talking about the Mickey Mouse sequence. There is a bit where just for about 5-10 minutes, a fiddling cat and Mickey Mouse have a dance and a sing-song, and it doesn't really relate to the plot, but it's quite pleasurable to watch.
Yeah, no, it's very enjoyable. Especially because like Mickey Mouse is like it's always kind of a little bit perplexing when you see that character and you're trying to reverse engineer in your mind, like, what is happening? What is that? It can't be a person. I guess it must be a monkey. But the effect is that it looks like a kind of drunken mouse, like staggering around. But sorry. Chris, you were
No. I think that narratively, you're right. That certainly. Oh well, I agree with you in terms of Snow White. After she basically gets to the cottage, it's just a series of wash up, eat, music sequence, bedtime. It's just a series of things. In this film, I felt like a lot of the characters were, yes, they had these little moments, but they often don't share. They're often kind of paired off. So Laurel and Hardy often appear in scenes just with themselves. And then there are these big moments where they come back together, where they seem to have some sort of public trial, where there's a dunking sequence, and then they're all off again. So I mean, structurally, I mean, it's there's not much of there's not much plot, but the fantasy, I suppose I don't know whether it lends itself because of the fact there's this sort of compendium, as you said, of all these different fantasy characters. Whether the point is that, as we've talked about on the podcast before, that this is an immersive fantasy, so it's just in a fantasy world, and so you sort of the fantasy characters do the job of building the world, and they give enough information for us to just be like, yeah, we're just going to kind of meander through all these different. And I don't understand if the villain is just he's not a fantasy. He's just a character. He's just made up for this film. He's not like a character from a story, is he, or not?
No,
Barnaby.
I think the Barnaby character does track back to the original
Right.
to the original operetta.
Is he lifted from any kind of fairy tale?
Gosh, I don't know.
Because you're right. I know we thought about it's odd that we do have this. There are villains in fairy tale.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
And it made them the villain. Yeah.
Actually, just an interest, since we're talking about villains and Silas Barnaby, just an interesting little bit of trivia here, which is that the actor is credited as Henry Kleinbach. That he would change his name to Henry Brandon, and is probably more famous to like cinephiles as the actor who plays Scar in John Ford's The Searchers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and you might think, well, that's strange because there's a 20-year difference between these two films, and in The Searchers, he seems like at best in his 40s, or at the oldest in his early 40s. So what's going on there? And the fact is that Henry Kleinbach, when he played Silas Barnaby in Babes in Toyland, he was 21. Like that, so yeah, I mean, it's like mind blowing, right?
Yeah.
But and he's really he gives a very convincing kind of old man in a kind of pantomime style. I mean, it's obviously mannered and stylized, but it's not, nonetheless, it is kind of impressive that he could pull that off at the age of 21 or 22 or whatever.
To the extent that I was troubled a lot by the kind of him wanting Bo Peep quite so kind of
yes,
like it's and I was like, this is like a comfortably 50-year-old man here, and then and I suspect the plot wants us to think that, so that I'm not going to excuse the film and its sexual politics in that respect, but well done him for at least troubling me that much.
I guess Henry Brandon then specializes in these roles where you kidnap a woman who is far too young. That's how he'll come down in film history.
Just to come back to the Mickey Mouse point, because there's a half-baked thought going around that I'd like to put back in the oven or see if it's ready, which is there is an odd that thing about you can have Mickey Mouse. It just made me suddenly think of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is another example, right? I mean, I think there were some much more official negotiations there, but that is another rare example of a non-Disney product being lent to Mickey Mouse. And there are these weird examples of, like, I think with the Deadpool films, there are a few of these things where, like, at least anecdotally within the press, it probably happened through a bunch of lawyers. But, like, I just had a chat with Kevin Feige, says, such and such. And he said, yeah, come on set. We've got a Thor costume. And there's this kind of, like, there's a part of the discourse of these kind of playful movies.
Right.
Is that the producers are required to adopt this kind of playfulness in the, hey, yeah, it's all good fun, just kind of enjoy yourself, kind of thing. So is there something about Mickey Mouse, the stakes are lower when Mickey Mouse is being used in properties like this, where we're not being asked to take, you're not being asked to take seriously that Mickey Mouse is in this world in the same way you are being asked to take seriously that Pluto is in Mickey Mouse's world.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
But isn't in this case the idea? I can imagine that Disney agreed to it being used, and you're right in the case of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. There's lots of information about you can have Daffy Duck and Donald Duck have to be on the same screen for the same amount of time, and I think the scene with Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, again, they have to be when Eddie Valiant is falling from a plane or a height or something. I can't remember exactly what it is. They're on screen at the same time and for the same amount of seconds and all this sort of stuff. But I imagine in this film, I can imagine Disney going, well, what the audiences aren't gonna go, oh, that's Mickey Mouse. They're going to go, oh, Mickey Mouse is famous in that world as well because somebody has been dressed up or something has been dressed up. Some whatever you said, some sort of something rat or I can't remember what you said. But this sort of but something has been. So there's almost a reinforcement that okay, this is part of this pantomime where characters. Widow Twanky plays something else in this way. So there's all these layers of performance. But I think certainly in this film, you get the sense of I see that there is a prestige that is being attached to Mickey Mouse. That is not the Mickey Mouse because Mickey Mouse is drawn. Like that would be absurd. This is a sort of rendition of his stardom.
Mickey Mouse is in the same fantasy hall of fame that you mentioned earlier that includes the Three Little Pigs, Bo Peep, like these kind of iconic, figures of folklore. Mickey Mouse is now one of them, and there's something useful about that in terms of given that he's only about 6-7 years old at this point.
I know, exactly. So Mickey Mouse has already reached that level of he belongs in this world.
Let me read out actually another passage here. This is from that same review in Time that I think speaks to the point here, where the film is described as a queer blend of Alice in Wonderland, Mother Goose, Laurel and Hardy, and Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade.
Yeah,
and I think that the Macy's reference is a nice one here. Because this was only a decade or so into like the existence of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, but I think it's the same kind of not really in this universe ness quality that you refer to, whereas you would see Mickey Mouse in Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, but no one thinks, oh, this is canon or something like that. I think the same thing with like Babes in Toyland. You're right that it's showing you Mickey Mouse, but not with the assumption that that this is part of the Disney verse or something like that, but just that here's something else for kids to ooh and ah at, something for them to recognize maybe, rather than for it to have like any narrative significance.
No.
On the Macy's point, and I don't have a lot to say about this other than kind of instinct, so if anyone else has, then great. But there also seems to be something quite American about the use of fairy tales here, in the sense that these are all European, other than Mickey Mouse. These are all nominally European folkloric fairy tales.
Right.
But there is the beginning, or maybe even, I don't know when all this happened, but there are certain, like Bo Peep and Mother Goose, do not have the same traction in fairy tale lore. Right. Those are not, people don't read Bo Peep very much back home, in the UK, I should say, because these characters, but certainly Mother Goose feels this is all based on instinct. Really, I don't really have a lot to say about this, but there are fairy tale characters that have certain traction in the States, and there are fairy tale. There's no Hansel and Gretel here because I don't remember there being any of them. There's none of those. Cinderella's not in it. These kind of slightly more kind of more codified as French, European, German, even. This has a more American feel, so it's interesting that they cite the Macy's parade there, particularly that Mother Goose character becoming, because Mother Goose obviously isn't the author of these nursery rhymes. They're all, I think these are all Perrault. I think Mother Goose is a Perrault invention, right? So but Mother Goose has become, Mother Goose's fairy tales, right? But again, that's a thing in the States rather than in the UK so much. I think the old woman that lived in a shoe, similar kind of thing. So there we are. There's my ramble over. Does anyone want to make sense of that?
There's a lot of insight there, because I think that you could make the case that Babes in Toyland, in the form that that Roach brought to realization, is kind of in between different fairy tale traditions. On the one hand, there is that European tradition, which is often associated with this idea of like moral pedagogy or something like that. Don't go with Hansel and Gretel. I guess like the lesson is like don't go into the woods and talk to like a mysterious old woman or something. Like there is this kind of like how to behave or how to act, Aesop's fable kind of aspect to the European fairy tale tradition, whereas the American fairy tale tradition, or at least as associated with Baum and Oz and things like that, tends to be more in terms of like there is disorder within a kingdom and we need to restore order within that kingdom, right?
Yeah.
That's never the case. I mean, that's not the case in Cinderella. It's not the case in Sleeping Beauty. Well, I guess maybe it is the case in Sleeping Beauty, but it is much more the case in the L. Frank Baum tradition. And I think that Babes in Toyland kind of has its feet in each of those traditions. That the overarching narrative seems to come from L. Frank Baum, but at the same time we're populating the world with all of these characters that are coming from a European tradition instead.
It's interesting.
No, I didn't really think that other than I there are other, obviously this is also the time where there are lots of other animation studios, and so there's almost a sort of reassertion of Disney's relationship to the fairy, because the Fleischers make a version of the kids in the shoe from 1935. So a lot of as animation is getting kind of solidified into this viable economic industry, it's being industrialized, and so you have a number of studios on the east and the west coast making lots and lots of kind of really vibrant, really exciting cartoons. So Disney is obviously important to this narrative, but there are a number of studios, Fleischers, Van Buren, a lot of studios at the time that are making fairy tale cartoons of this. There are versions of the Three Little Pigs that would have been popular and famous, and but not done by Disney, done by the Fleischers or the Children in the Shoe, and so I'm just wondering what that it's interesting that they it's Mickey Mouse that appears in this film, and not any of those, and so it sort of tells you a little bit, I think, that that Mickey belongs in this world of yes, the kind of, what am I saying? The sort of the American fantasy, the performance of Mickey Mouse is something that this is not an original performance. This is a performance of a character that is being inhabited, and that is telling us something about the supremacy of a particular character, a particular time that is only 6 or 7 years old, as you said, Alex. So yeah, I just thought I think the other animation studios that are making these kinds of movies are sort of, I don't know much about them, but they seem a lot less American. Disney's the most American of these versions, but anyway.
But I wonder also whether you could track in relation to like the use of Mickey Mouse and the Three Little Pigs, whether there's an element, again the connection with Macy's, an element in which we're looking at the emergence of a children's consumer culture at the same time, where all of these characters become these kind of mobile signifiers that can be used, in marketing, in promotion, in toys, and so on and so forth. I mean, Babes in Toyland, I mean, it's there in the title, toy, right? Toys seem to be part of the idea or the behind this movie. It's a film that came out around Thanksgiving in 1934, maybe even on Thanksgiving, that then would be like regularly played for decades and decades and decades, beginning in the 1950s on television in the run up to Christmas. And whether the whole the whole kind of weird assemblage of all of these different child characters uh, is part of that as well. In relation to which, actually, one further thing, that there's a little game that Laurel and Hardy play throughout the movie, Pee-wee, where they have a stick, they hit it on the ground, a little pot goes up in the air, and they try to hit it. That was actually, I've seen reports, although I have not, despite some eBay searches, found any evidence that this was ever made, that they did decide to do a kind of tie-in PV Laurel and Hardy toy in relation to Babes in Toyland. which is interesting. I mean, this idea that Laurel and Hardy do silly games is already there in The Devil's Brother, where and it's alluded to in Babes in Toyland, where they refer to Neezy, what is it, Neezy, Easy, Nosy, like this. He says, talk, and then Stan Laurel also does the finger wiggle thing, which is like this, where you go, like that, and. And there's a reference to that, which in Babes in Toyland, when Oliver Hardy is like, anything you can do, I can do, and he can't, and but Stan Laurel is like, oh really? And then he refers to earsy, neesy, nosy, and finger wiggle, which those are callbacks to The Devil's Brother. But it's with Babes in Toyland that they decide to make this something that they can sell to kids, as opposed to just something that you could do with your hands, right?
I'm conscious we're getting towards the end of this conversation, and we should probably do due diligence to the actual animation sequence.
I was wondering when
that kind of ends this movie that we've kind of teased already. So I don't know, Rob, do you want to anything you can tell us about the kind of the making of this that is interesting or useful for us to know?
Well, actually, in terms of the making of film, just before we get to the animation, I wanted to return back to Chris's point about how the film is kind of, it feels like it's kind of two-headed. On the one hand, there's the Laurel and Hardy scenes. On the other hand, there's all the other scenes. Actually, they had two directors working on the film, and Gus Mines, who was from the Our Gang, the director of the Our Gang shorts, he did the non-Laurel and Hardy sequences, and the Laurel and Hardy sequences were filmed by Charlie Rogers. And just to blow your mind a little bit more, given that all three of us went to Warwick, Charlie Rogers, he didn't. I don't know whether he went to University of Warwick, but he's British, and he was born in Birmingham.
Okay.
So it all comes
Lovely.
together. So, anyway, so that point, but yes, so the animated sequences, where towards the end we have it's really just a few shots for the where we have stop motion wooden soldiers assembling for war, right? It's just a few shots where they are stop motion figures. For the majority of the film, the wooden soldiers are just people dressed up in wooden soldier makeup and things like that. Like these, the stop motion sequences were done by Roy Seawright and Kenneth Peach, and they would go on to work on Topper. Which has special effects with the ghost primarily using superimposition, but I think maybe like one of the interesting legacies here is that they would also go on to work on 1,000,000 Years BC,
Right.
as the early kind of like the early, when is it, 1942 something, I can't remember.
Yeah,
but
something like that.
I mean, that's the film where like it's Roy Seawright, it's lizards on which he's put like more dinosaur-y like costuming, and then just filmed them that way. But yeah, so there is an interesting legacy of effects that pass through Roach that would go through the stop motion in Babes in Toyland and end up with like 1,000,000 Years BC and like anticipating Jurassic Park, I suppose.
Most films are. No, I mean my note was I was surprised that when the characters are introduced, as you said, they are humans dressed up as toys, and then it seems a lot more laborious and a lot more of a faff to make that sequence stop motion than to not just dress up people. Like
Right.
there's a and it does stand out, but it also obviously lends itself to the fact that the film is about kind of toys. But all that we know of, and I think there's even a moment, I'm looking at it here, where there's a sort of split screen where you have the human characters and then the stop motion side by side. So the human the stop motion soldiers emerge from the warehouse. I was struck by the fact that I was surprised that a lot of effort has gone into making this almost quite clearly stop motion. It has that sort of that aura of stop motion with regards to these are clearly objects. These are clearly pro-filmic. They are existing and they are material. They're clearly located in space, and clearly the animation is, as Suzanne Buckle would say, that we've talked about on this podcast before. It's because of animation special powers that these are moving. And I was trying to figure out why not just dress up, and I was wondering about kind of the objectness, the fact that a lot of stop motion and animation more broadly, you tend to think of it as this illusion of life, but a lot of stop motion animators in particular, people that are working with puppets and objects and artifacts and bits of whatever found objects, let's say Svankmajer, they see it not as the animation of life, but the sort of dramatization of deadness. The objects have. Svankmajer says that objects are more expressed there. He says, for me, objects are more alive than people, more permanent and more expressive. The memories they possess far exceed the memories of man. Objects conceal within themselves the events that they've witnessed. And so he always sees his work not as taking something and making it move and making it alive, but what it's doing, it's dramatizing the deadness of the thing, because it can't move. And there's I think it's his version of Alice, where you have a kind of taxidermied rabbit, and you watch that film, you don't go, oh, the rabbit's come back to life. It's dramatizing the deadness of the rabbit through animation. And so I was trying to figure out whether we know that toys can't do this, because toys are very different to Mother Goose, who are very different to. So I was just trying to get my head around why that sequence is so kind of effective, both on screen and then also sort of the labor that goes into making quite a short sequence, when we've already seen ways in the film that illusion could be created.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. Although I wonder whether I would want to modify it from dramatizing the deadness, which sounds a little bit sinister, to dramatizing the toyness of the soldiers. Because I believe that there were wooden soldier tie-ins, toys for this film, and so when you see the stop motion soldiers actually on screen, that's the point at which this is the thing that you can own. This is the thing that you. I mean, I don't think it's like quite as nakedly commercial, or as maybe my words are implying. Like, far from it. But you get to see the toyness of the toy, right? Something that you can have at home, whereas you can't take home a 6-foot man dressed in I suppose you could, but that person's probably going to get arrested.
You could just do it the one time.
But interestingly enough, like if we're talking about the appeal of that sequence for a child audience, it is worth noting that a lot of concerns, a lot of reviews, and even like some of the PCA files are very concerned that the bogeyman sequence is way too scary for children.
Okay.
Like, to the point at which, like, in certainly on the international market, that sequence was edited in a number of countries, and in fact, I think the film was actually banned in Latvia altogether because of the bogeyman sequence being too terrifying for children. But then it's interesting because there's no like stop motion equivalent to the bogeyman, right? They're just people like who look like, I don't know what they look like. They look like Moss Man from He-Man, but yeah, they are just people, whereas the wooden soldiers kind of toggle between the two identities.
But the stop motion sequence gives them a real sense of order, which is very different to, like, there's a uniformity that the stop motion allows, that for all stop motion's sort of signature jerkiness and that unruly, frenetic, sort of secondary movement that you can't get away from with stop motion. There's something very uniform about the way that's used, versus, you're right, when the lead up to that, when they're sort of bursting through the gates of Toyland, essentially, or they're quite unwieldy and quite savage and quite sort of, and the comparison between those two armies, I think, is really helped by the stop motion that gives it a sense of control, because obviously that's how, and precision, because that's how stop motion is done. It will create a different illusion than somebody dressed up in a suit. But your point about the censorship, obviously so the film, when it was then re-released, or it had a different name, or it had a couple of different names, didn't it? It was Laurel. So are any cuts being made at this point with regards to the film, or is it just rebadged, sometimes known as Laurel and Hardy's Babes in Toyland, or is it also known? So I'm just interested in that sort of journey of the film.
Yeah, it gets really complicated here. Like, how does Babes in Toyland become March of the Wooden Soldiers?
Yeah.
Like, if I can, this is drawing on memory, but also, so I'm going to get things wrong, but this will be broad strokes. In the mid 1940s, Bill LeBaron, who was a former producer executive at Paramount, had a film company, I think it was called Federal Pictures, that he established, and they were planning to make a remake of Babes in Toyland, with a view to which they acquired the rights from the Herbert estate, as part of which they also acquired the rights to the Roach film. Now, that remake never gets made. And then different bits of the rights get sold to other companies. So that, for example, I think Federal keeps 35 millimeter US and Canadian rights, whereas there's a distributor, Joseph Auerbach, who gets the 35 millimeter non-US and Canada screening rights, as well as 16 millimeter kind of school library home viewing rights, in relation to which, however, they couldn't use the name Babes in Toyland, right? Initially, I think the title that was used for the home market was something utterly banal. I think it was Revenge is Sweet was the first title that was used. But then, which has no reference to anything. I mean, like, that could be the name of almost any movie, you feel. But eventually, March of the Wooden Soldiers is the film that, is the title that gets used and that ends up sticking when it eventually goes into kind of yearly circulation as a holiday movie, beginning in around the mid 1950s. So that's where the retitling happens. Yeah. Wait, I'm blank. What was the earlier? Was that
Which bits got cut?
which bits got cut?
Yeah, I was just interested in that sort of. It doesn't seem a film that's spectacularly controversial, but obviously for children, I can see that some of the sequences were. So I just wondered if in the journey of a film that seems to be going by another name and is then re-released, or in the 40s, whether or not cuts were then made, or I was just interested in that element.
There were additional cuts made, although I don't think those cuts are preserved in the versions that circulate today.
Right.
One of I think that, for subsequent re-release, there was a cut made, I think, when Tom Tom and Little Bo Peep wake up next to one another in Bogeyland, having spent the night, a night of terror. And I mean, I think that, all of these, like, censor, things are really censors just telling on themselves. Like, why would, like, because what? Like, Little Bo Peep and Tom Tom, they had sex down in Bogeylands. Like, that's what they did that night. So we could, we need to, like, to avoid any implication. No, like, that's nonsense. But nonetheless, that I think was a scene that was cut for subsequent re-release. And then there are multiple colorized versions as well. There's a colorized version from the 90s, I think, and a colorized version from the mid 2000s.
They're not terrible, actually.
They're not.
I watched about 5
They're-
minutes of
they're-
one,
yeah,
and
they're-
they're not terrible.
Well, they're acceptable, and I think, it's interesting in this connection that the set for Toyland was apparently very brightly colored. Stan Laurel like is on record as saying that he wished that this film had actually been made as a Technicolor movie, which I think is a correct instinct, given how Technicolor was used at that point in time, where it's fantasy that gets associated with color. And as obviously most famously in the Wizard of Oz. And just to like add a little bit of story to the sets and settings, that there was a plan that once the film was completed that they would donate the set to create a playground out in Griffith Park for children using the set. But obviously that set was not created with outdoor weather conditions in mind, so that that never happened. I mean, it would have been like it would have been the reality of the story of the Three Little Pigs, where you just get the whole set blows down, like it all like gets rained away in Griffith Park. But yeah.
I'm aware you've got a hard out, Rob. So to bring things to a close. I mean, thanks for talking through Babes in Toyland. I think I feel I understand the movie a bit more, and if those who want to watch it, it's not necessarily a film where understanding is easy or cohesive.
We did a bad job if we're understanding this film,
or at least I'm at peace with my lack of understanding better now. But to kind of shift gears a little bit, your new book, to remind listeners, Man of Taste, the erotic cinema of Radley Metzger, is out. People can get it now, and also I've highlighted two other books that relates a little bit more to what we're talking about. But tell us a little bit about what this book is, in case people are interested in reading more of your work.
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily covering films that you want to watch like on a double bill with Babes in Toyland.
Sure.
It's a study of filmmaker Radley Metzger, who was kind of a pioneer in taking the sexploitation film of the 1960s and kind of gentrifying it in a way that borrowed off codes of art cinema to create what we would think of today as softcore cinema. But then a filmmaker who, in the 1970s, with Deep Throat and then the hardcore porn explosion of that decade, he then that meant that the market for softcore films more or less dries up. And so he takes a pseudonym, and he then goes on to make some of the most acclaimed hardcore films of all time, albeit films that he was always reluctant to acknowledge that he had made these.
Yeah,
terrific. So I'll say it one more time: Man of Taste, the erotic cinema of Radley Metzger, available now, as well as Rob's other books, The Fun Factory and Hokum, the early sound slapstick short and Depression era mass culture. Do check those works out if you haven't already. Otherwise, Rob, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and chatting to us about Laurel and Hardy as well as hardcore pornography. It's been a fun time. You can, of course, follow us at fantasy-animation.org, at Fananim Research, FANANIM Research, on the various social media channels that we are on. And you can also email us at fananimresearch@gmail.com if you have any feedback or suggestions for future Footnote episodes. Otherwise, it's been us for another week, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.